Right before the cameras rolled, a staffer rushed to Jeff Van Drew with a note that read, "Don't let her mention the timeline." But the moment the hearing started, she already had the timeline in her hand. What happened next wasn't supposed to leak. Stay connected till the end to know what actually happened. Before we dive into how Jasmine Crockett cornered a congressman using his own signature against him, make sure you hit that subscribe button because this story involves sealed documents, contractor corruption, and a moment so tense that the committee chairman had no choice but to call an emergency recess. The House Judiciary Committee chamber has seen its share of political theater over the years. Impeachment hearings, Supreme Court confirmation battles, constitutional showdowns that become part of the historical record. But most oversight hearings are decidedly less dramatic. They're technical, procedural, the kind of governmental process that matters enormously for accountability, but rarely makes headlines. Today's session was supposed to be one of those, a routine review of ICE enforcement practices, and federal detention facility oversight. The witness list included mid-level agency officials, some policy experts, and a few advocacy organization representatives. Nothing that would typically draw more than a handful of reporters or generate any viral moments. Jasmine Crockett had other plans. She'd spent the previous week doing something that most members of Congress don't bother with for routine oversight hearings, actual investigation. Her legal background had taught her that the most important information is often buried in the documents nobody expects you to read. The appendices, the footnotes, the administrative records that get filed because they're required, but rarely reviewed. And in this case, she'd found something extraordinary. Evidence that a comprehensive ICE abuse report, one that was supposed to have been submitted to Congress 6 months earlier, had been completed, signed off on by multiple officials and then quietly sealed in a restricted archive where congressional oversight committees couldn't access it without specific authorization. The report detailed systematic problems at detention facilities across 3 states, inadequate medical care, questionable use of solitary confinement, financial irregularities in contractor payments, and what investigators had termed credible allegations of abuse by personnel at multiple sites. It was exactly the kind of document that federal law required be shared with congressional oversight committees, and it had been deliberately hidden. What made this even more interesting was the signature page. Among the officials who'd signed off on the report's findings, indicating they'd reviewed it and verified its accuracy, was someone who now sat on the House Judiciary Committee. Jeff Van Drew, the New Jersey congressman who'd famously switched from Democrat to Republican and had built his new partisan identity largely on hardline immigration positions and unwavering support for ICE enforcement. Van Drew had reviewed this report during his brief stint on an administrative oversight board before coming to Congress, and his signature appeared right there on page 17 next to a certification that he'd reviewed the findings and recommended appropriate remedial action. Now, 18 months later, Van Drew was one of the loudest voices, claiming that concerns about ICE detention conditions were overblown, Democratic talking points, that facilities were well run and properly monitored, and that anyone raising abuse allegations was simply trying to undermine immigration enforcement for political purposes. He'd made these arguments in committee hearings, on cable news, and in press releases. And apparently he was hoping nobody would remember or discover that he'd once signed a document saying the exact opposite. Crockett had discovered it and she'd come to this hearing prepared to make Van Drew explain how his signature ended up on a report he now claimed didn't exist. The hearing opened normally enough. Chairman Jim Jordan gave brief opening remarks about the importance of proper oversight while also supporting law enforcement. Ranking Member Jerry Nadler responded with comments about balancing security with human rights. Various members asked preliminary questions of the first witness, an ICE official who gave careful, non-committal answers to everything. It was all very procedural, very forgettable, exactly what everyone expected. Then Crockett got her 5 minutes. She started with a question that seemed innocuous. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask our ICE representative about the status of the comprehensive facility review that was completed in March of last year. Can you tell us whether that review identified any systemic issues that required congressional attention? The ICE official looked confused. I'm not sure which specific review you're referring to. Congresswoman, we conduct multiple facility assessments. I'm referring to the March 24th review conducted by the Joint Agency Task Force. Crockett clarified, reading from a document in front of her. The one that examined detention facilities in Texas, Arizona, and California, the one that was supposed to be submitted to this committee, but somehow never arrived. Are you familiar with that review? The official shifted uncomfortably. I have to check our records to determine. Let me help you out. Crockett interrupted smoothly. Because I have a copy of the executive summary right here and it makes for pretty disturbing reading. Inadequate medical staffing at 70% of reviewed facilities, financial discrepancies totaling over $3 million in contractor payments. Multiple credible allegations of abuse that were never properly investigated. This review found all of that. So my question is, why wasn't this submitted to Congress as federal law requires? The room's energy had changed completely. Other committee members were now paying attention. Journalists in the press gallery had stopped scrolling their phones, and Jeff Andrew, sitting 3 seats down from Crockett, had gone very still in a way that suggested he knew exactly where this was heading. The ICE official tried to deflect. Without seeing the specific document you're referencing, I can't speak to. Oh, I can show you the document, Crockett said, pulling out a thick folder. In fact, I can show the whole committee because what I have here is not just the report itself, but the administrative record showing who reviewed it, who signed off on it, and who specifically recommended that it be classified as restricted and sealed instead of being submitted to congressional oversight. She paused, letting the implications sink in. Then she turned to look directly at Vandrew. Congressman Vandrew, you served on the Administrative Oversight Board during the period when this report was completed, correct? Vandrew's expression had gone from still to frozen. I served on multiple boards and reviewed numerous documents during that time. This isn't numerous documents, Congressman. This is a specific report about systematic abuse and financial irregularities at IC detention facilities. And unless someone forged your signature, you reviewed this report and certified its findings. She held up a page, angling it toward the cameras. That's your signature on page 17, isn't it? The room erupted in murmurs. Vandrew was visibly flustered, his face re-eaning. I would need to see the context. The context is right here, Crockett said, her voice sharp now. The context is that you signed a document acknowledging serious problems at detention facilities, problems that included credible abuse allegations and millions of dollars in financial discrepancies. And then after you switched parties and joined this committee, you spent 18 months telling the American people that concerns about IC detention conditions are Democratic propaganda. So which version is true, Congressman? The one where you certified that serious problems existed or the one where you claim those problems are made up? Before Vandrew could respond, something unusual happened. A staffer, young, clearly nervous, hurried down the aisle and handed Vandrew a folded piece of paper. Vandrew opened it, read it quickly, and his expression somehow got even more uncomfortable. Several other committee members noticed the exchange, and the murmuring in the room grew louder. Crockett noticed too, and she smiled slightly. Congressman, did your staff just give you advice on how to answer my question? Because I'm genuinely curious what explanation could possibly make sense here. You signed off on a report documenting serious problems. You certified the findings as accurate, and then you spent over a year claiming those exact problems don't exist. That's not a difference of opinion. That's a contradiction that needs explaining. Vandrew tried to regain his footing. The Congresswoman is taking a complex administrative process and oversimplifying it for political effect. I'm reading your signature. Crockett cut him off. That's not oversimplification. That's documentation. And here's what else I have documentation of. After this report was completed and you signed off on it, it was classified as restricted and sealed. Not because it contained national security information. There's nothing in here that meets that threshold, but because it was politically inconvenient. Because it showed that facilities run by contractors with significant political donations to certain members and campaigns were operating with inadequate oversight and possible corruption. She pulled out another document. In fact, let me read from the section you specifically signed off on. Contractor oversight at facilities in Texas appears inadequate to prevent financial irregularities. Further investigation recommended into the relationship between contractor billing practices and facility management. You certified that finding. Congressman, you agreed it needed investigation. So why, when you came to Congress, did you never mention it? Why did you never push for that investigation? Why did you instead become one of the loudest defenders of these exact contractors? The question hung in the air like an accusation, which is exactly what it was. Van Drew looked like he was trying to formulate a response that wouldn't make things worse. But Crockett wasn't done. Let me tell you what I think happened. She continued, her tone shifting from prosecutorial to explanatory, like a lawyer laying out a case for a jury. I think you reviewed this report. You saw that it documented serious problems and you did what you were supposed to do. You signed off on it and recommended action. But then something changed. Maybe you decided you wanted to switch parties and needed to establish conservative credentials. Maybe you realized that being tough on immigration was going to be your ticket to staying in office after you switched. Or maybe, and this is what really concerns me, you were approached by people with financial interests in these detention facilities and convinced that this report needed to disappear. Vander tried to interrupt. That's a serious allegation without any. It's a question, not an allegation, Crockett corrected. But since you bring it up, let's talk about your campaign contributions. Since you switched parties and took this hardline pro-ICE position, you've received over $200,000 from executives and companies connected to private detention facility operations. That's not classified information. It's in your FEC filings. So, here's my question. Did any of those donors ever discuss this report with you? Did anyone ever suggest that having it released to Congress would be bad for business? The room was completely silent now, except for the sound of reporters typing frantically. Vandrew's face had gone from red to pale. Chairman Jordan looked like he was trying to figure out whether to intervene or let this play out. And Crockett, sensing she had Vandrew completely cornered, pressed her advantage. Here's what really troubles me. Congressman, this report documented that detention facilities were spending $6 per day on food for detainees. $6. That's less than most school lunch programs. And the report found that some contractors were billing the government for $12 per day while actually spending $6, pocketing the difference. You signed off on findings that showed contractors were literally profiting by keeping detained immigrants on starvation-level food budgets. And now you're on this committee defending those same contractors and attacking anyone who raises concerns about conditions. How do you explain that? Vandrew finally found his voice, but it came out defensive and weak. The detention system is complex, and isolated issues don't mean. These weren't isolated issues, Crockett interrupted, holding up the thick report. This was a systematic review of dozens of facilities that found problems everywhere investigators looked. Medical neglect, financial fraud, abuse allegations, inadequate food, you name it. And it was all documented, certified, and then buried. And you were part of burying it. She pulled out one more document, and this one seemed to genuinely surprise Vandrew. This is an internal memo from April of last year, 1 month after you signed the report. It's from the Administrative Oversight Board to the Facility Review Team, and it specifically instructs them to restrict access to the March report pending further review of classification requirements. And guess who was one of 3 board members who voted for that restriction? You want to see the vote record, Congressman, because I have it right here. Andrew's microphone suddenly cut out. He'd started to respond, but no sound came through the speakers. For a moment, there was confusion. Was it technical difficulties or something else? Vrew tapped his microphone, looking increasingly flustered while the committee's technical staff scrambled to fix it. The optics were terrible. It looked like he was being silenced, even though it was almost certainly just a technical glitch. Crockett used the moment perfectly. While we wait for the congressman's microphone to work, let me just note for the record that every document I've referenced today has been submitted to the committee as evidence. The report, the signature page, the vote record, all of it. This isn't speculation or partisan attack. This is documented fact. A comprehensive abuse report was completed, signed off on by multiple officials, including Congressman Vanru, and then deliberately sealed so Congress couldn't see it. That's not proper oversight. That's a cover-up. Vandru's microphone came back on, and he immediately jumped in, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. The Congresswoman is engaging in character assassination based on selective reading of complex administrative. Congressman, this is literally your signature, Crockett said. And this time, she actually laughed. Not a mean laugh, but the kind of incredulous laugh that comes from watching someone deny something that's obviously true. I'm not selectively reading anything. You signed this document. You certified these findings. You voted to restrict congressional access to it. These are facts. And the reason you're so upset right now isn't because I'm being unfair. It's because I found the receipts behind Vandru. Several Republican members were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Representative Tom McClintock was reading something on his phone with a concerned expression. Representative Kelly Armstrong was whispering to a staffer. Even Chairman Jordan looked troubled, clearly recognizing that this had gone beyond normal partisan back and forth into something more serious. Crockett wasn't finished. Let's talk about what this means for the people affected by this cover-up. We're talking about detention facilities where people, including families with children, were being held in conditions that your own signed report described as inadequate and potentially abusive. Where food budgets were so low that it amounted to nutritional neglect. Where medical care was so insufficient that detainees with serious health conditions weren't getting treatment. And when a federal review documented all of this, instead of bringing it to Congress so we could fix it, it got sealed and hidden. How many people suffered because this report never reached the people who could have done something about it? She looked directly at Vandru. You want to talk about getting the bad guys out? You use that phrase all the time. We need to get the bad guys out. We need to secure the border. We need to be tough on illegal immigration. Fine, but what about the bad guys who run facilities that abuse detainees and defraud taxpayers? What about the bad guys who pocket money that's supposed to go toward feeding people? Why are you so passionate about catching people crossing the border illegally, but completely silent about contractors stealing from the government and mistreating people in custody? Vandru tried to pivot to his standard talking points about border security, but Crockett cut him off immediately. We're not talking about border security. We're talking about your signature on a report you now claim doesn't exist. We're talking about your vote to hide that report from Congress. We're talking about your financial connections to the contractors that report criticized. Stay on topic, Congressman. Explain your signature. The tension in the room had reached a breaking point. Vandru looked at Chairman Jordan, clearly hoping for some kind of intervention, some procedural ruling that would end this line of questioning. Jordan, recognizing that he had to do something, raised his gavel. The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Chairman, I ask for an additional 2 minutes, Crockett said quickly. Using a procedural option that the chair could grant at his discretion. Jordan hesitated. Denying the request would look like he was protecting Vandru. Granting it would mean more of this devastating questioning. He made a calculation. The gentle lady is granted an additional 2 minutes. Crockett nodded her thanks and turned back to Vandru. Congressman, let me ask you a direct yes or no question. Did you ever discuss this report or the decision to restrict congressional access to it with any executives or representatives from detention facility contractors? Vandru's face was now visibly sweating under the hearing room lights. I had many conversations during my time on the oversight board. Yes or no, Congressman? Did contractors discuss this report with you? The Congresswoman is trying to create some conspiracy. Yes or no? Vandru looked trapped. A yes would confirm that contractors had influenced the cover-up. A no would be easily disproven if Crockett had evidence of such conversations, and her confident questioning suggested she might. He chose a middle path that satisfied no one. I don't recall specific conversations about specific reports from over a year ago. Crockett smiled. You don't recall. That's convenient. But you also don't deny it. Let me help your memory. Do you recall meeting with representatives from CoreCivic? One of the largest detention facility contractors on April 15th of last year. That's 2 weeks after you signed the report and 1 week after you voted to restrict it. Do you recall that meeting? Vander looked genuinely shocked that she had this information. I meet with many constituents and stakeholders. CoreCivic isn't your constituent. Congressman, they're a Nashville-based corporation, but they did donate $50,000 to your campaign 3 weeks after that meeting. Does that help your memory? The murmuring behind Vandrew had grown loud enough that Jordan had to gavel for order. Several Republican members looked genuinely shocked, clearly not having known about this connection. Vandrew opened his mouth, closed it, and then made a decision that would become the story's defining moment. Mr. Chairman, I move for an emergency recess. The room exploded. An emergency recess is almost never called during member questioning. It's a dramatic step that suggests something has gone seriously wrong. Jordan looked stunned by the request. Crockett's expression was pure vindication. And Vandrew looked like he desperately wanted to be anywhere else. Mr. Chairman, I object to the recess, Crockett said immediately. The congressman called for transparency in immigration enforcement. I'm providing it. If he has explanations for these documents, now is the time to give them. Jordan was trapped. Granting the recess would look like a cover-up. Denying it would mean forcing Vandrew to continue answering questions he clearly couldn't answer without making things worse. After a long pause, he made his decision. The committee will take a 15-minute recess. As members stood and started filing out, Crockett remained seated. Documents spread before her, looking directly at the cameras that were still recording. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The image of her sitting calmly while chaos erupted around her while Vandrew rushed out of the room while staffers scrambled and other members whispered urgently said everything. During the recess, reporters mobbed Crockett in the hallway outside the committee room. She gave them the sound bite she'd been preparing. Today, we learned that a comprehensive report documenting abuse and fraud at detention facilities was completed, certified, and then deliberately hidden from Congress. We learned that one of the people who helped hide it now sits on this committee and has received substantial campaign contributions from the contractors that report criticized. And we learned that when confronted with his own signature, Congressman Vandrew couldn't explain his actions and had to call an emergency recess. The American people deserve better. I'll wait for him to provide real answers. The American people are watching. When the hearing reconvened, Vandrew was notably absent. His staff claimed he'd been called to an urgent meeting with leadership. Chairman Jordan announced that the committee would continue with other scheduled witnesses and that Vandrew's questioning would be addressed at a later time. Everyone in the room understood what that meant. Vandrew wasn't coming back to face more questions today, but the damage was done. By evening, Vandrew emergency recess was trending on social media. News outlets were pulling campaign finance records showing his contributions from detention contractors. Investigative reporters were filing FOIA requests for the full report. Crockett had referenced and good government groups were calling for an inspector general investigation into who decided to seal the report and why. Vandrew released a statement that night claiming Crockett had ambushed him with out-of-context documents and that he'd be happy to address the substance once he'd had time to review the materials properly. It was a damage control response that convinced no one, especially since he'd signed the original report and had 18 months to review it. The really significant development came 3 days later when the House Inspector General announced they'd opened an investigation into irregularities in the administrative handling of oversight reports related to detention facility conditions. It wasn't a direct result of Crockett's questioning officially at least, but everyone knew the connection. Her public confrontation had made it impossible for the issue to be quietly ignored. In a follow-up interview with MSNBC, Crockett explained why the Vandrew confrontation mattered beyond just one congressman's hypocrisy. This is about a pattern we keep seeing where people in power hide information that might be politically inconvenient. Whether it's abuse reports, financial audits, or policy reviews, if the findings don't support the narrative they want to tell, they seal it and hope nobody notices. Well, I noticed and I'm going to keep noticing because oversight means actually looking at what's being hidden, not just what's being shown. A constituent back in her Dallas district, himself an immigrant who had been detained for 3 months while his asylum case was processed, came to her next town hall specifically to thank her. The conditions I experienced, inadequate food, no real medical care, guards who treated us like animals, I tried to tell people, but nobody cared. Seeing you hold them accountable for hiding reports about exactly what I went through, that meant everything. Thank you for not letting them bury the truth. That moment, more than any of the viral clips or news coverage, reminded Crockett why the confrontation had been worth it. The documents and signatures and timeline mattered not because they embarrassed one congressman, but because they represented real harm to real people that powerful interests had tried to hide. If this deep dive into how Jasmine Crockett used a congressman's own signature to expose a detention abuse cover-up showed you how oversight is supposed to work, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the moments when accountability actually happens. Drop a comment telling us what sealed government reports you think need to be released. And share this with anyone who believes that transparency shouldn't depend on whether the findings are politically convenient. Your engagement helps us keep following these stories until the full truth comes out. Retry Claude can make mistakes.